Welcome to Frisky, a podcast on everything marketing and sexuality with Daniela and Athanasia.
Hi everyone.
Welcome.
Today we have a very special guest in the room with us this time. Carol Zanette, Associate Professor at NEOMA Business School in France and very dear friend and co-author.
Welcome, Carol. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, ladies. I'm very happy to be here in Liverpool and enjoying the sun, which is, I don't think that often that we can say that.
Only for you, Carol. Only for you.
It's very sunny in Liverpool, and we're excited to have you with us. Carol wrote one of the chapters in our edited book on sexuality in marketing and consumption around waxing, Brazilian waxing. And we're really excited to hear your thoughts about your research in that area. If you can tell us a little bit more about the chapter and your motivation to work on this project.
Okay, so I owe the idea of the chapter to my co-author, Scaraboto. And we have been doing research about the body and the grooming of the body and the modifications of the women's bodies for some time now. And she came up with this idea of Brazilian waxing, and I was like, yes, that's something that I really would like to investigate. It's it's a different research topic. You don't see a lot of people talking about this intimate research questions and areas. And when we started talking about it, basically, she said, we could have something about the intersection of empowerment and oppression and all the gender ideas behind it. But to be honest, we sort of already did this paper with another paper that we did together about shapewear. And we did not want to have the same paper. And so we started discussing about, what about women who do the waxing? Right, the workers. And so we started reading about it, and there are a couple of other works that have investigated and interviewed, women who do waxing. And when we were reading about this, we also started reading about the history of waxing, and we thought that there is this huge colonial mindset that sort of plays out in different aspects of the waxing process, from this empowerment oppression, is waxing being empowered or not, but also ideals of the body with no hair and the body with hair, and how it is ingrained in the Brazilian imaginary in the country, but also the Brazilian stereotype outside of Brazil, and how in the end, we see these workers more or less reproducing these imaginaries in their practices when they're dealing with clients, Western clients, or in Brazil, which we sort of have this tension between the upper classes and the lower classes, which is a tension that has been discussed in other works in CCT, for example, in Turkey. And we still have this it plays out also in the service. The chapter is just a literature review. We aim one day, hopefully, to interview the workers. Diane, if you listen to this, promising this year, we're going to go back to that. And that's it. It's a to-be continued work.
I can personally say that when you sent the pitch for the chapter, I realized how I disconnected the Brazilian as the waxing practice from Brazil, the country, as much as you have these labels like Hollywood, all these tags that the grooming industry puts on certain ways of dealing with your body and sort of taking care of yourself. And I completely disconnected from the Brazilian heritage and from, the exactly what you said before, the post-colonial implications of that. So for me, your chapter was a bit of a haha moment of how many things in our day-to-day consumption have this sort of legacy that we kind of don't see it straight away. So my question to you is, where is the Brazilian waxing coming from? What is this story in 3 minutes, even less, 3 words?
I think that pretty much with everything that still is in our consumption, female gendered practices is Sex and the City, right? Mm. We owe too much to that show for the good and the bad. But it was this episode, and I don't remember which one, probably was Samantha. It has to be Samantha. Which one of them exactly decided to go like, oh, this Brazilian waxing, which is this idea that you wax it all, right? And then, you know, the whole episode is about this, and I don't remember if they mentioned in the episode or it's just like something that was also going on at the time, that there was this beauty salon that was founded by 7 Brazilian sisters, the J sisters, because all their first names start with J. And they sort of putting this type of waxing in the market. And they wrote a book, you know, like it's not an amazing book, but like an entrepreneurial book, and how are like Brazilians connecting with North American clients. And so in the book, they tell a little bit the story of how they sort of started this idea of Brazilian waxing. And Sex and the City was a show that used to see what was trending and transform into material for the show. And so they did this with this idea of Brazilian waxing. We're talking about early 2000s, which is Sex and the City. And one of the things that is interesting is that for us as Brazilians, because I don't know if we introduced myself to the audience, but both co-authors, myself and Diane, we are Brazilians. For us, this is like self-evident, right? When you wax it all. And it's usually when you are in Brazil, it's sort of the opposite, to know that in other countries that's not usually the case. So it's like, oh really, people don't do it? And how do you go? I mean, also in Brazil you have this bikini culture. You are at the beach, and you know the bikinis are smaller than the rest of the road, so you have to be waxed. And so when we find out that, when we moved countries and we found out that it's not like a standard practice elsewhere, for us is also like a shock, you know. And I feel that this permeates the chapter, and I try to make this permeate my work in general, which is like, yeah, I mean, you Westerns see us Brazilians as sort of like exotic, but to us, like, whatever your practices are also very different, and we are also shocked. And there's this whole point of cleanness that we discuss in the chapter as well, how coloniality and otherness and sameness, cleanness or hygiene or standards of it really define these boundaries in historically, right?
I remember the Sex and the City episode with the Brazilian waxing, and the tagline, one of the most famous ones, wasn't it that you are walking sex?
Yes.
Which is quite interesting then, linking the Brazilian waxing practice with sexuality and with women's sexuality and desirability to the male gaze, in a sense. How is the male gaze in the Western context influences, in your opinion, women's desire to get the Brazilian waxing?
Well, I in the chapter, I mean, we never interviewed consumers about it, but for what we saw, also there, because the colonial imaginary also sort of was picked up by Brazilians, right? And when Brazil sells its image abroad, it sells sexuality. You think about Brazil, think about carnival, and you think about, you know, someone naked or almost naked. And this is also something that has been challenged in Brazil right now, specifically this carnival mulata figure. Mulata is a very heavy word that we should not be using, but was sold during years and years and years in Brazil. Like, we had this carnival is a big thing there. And the main television channel, Globo, for decades they had this like vignette with and they used to elect the mulata of the year, the mulata globeleza, and she was always naked and was very sexualized. And this is like the image of Brazil that is sold abroad and even to Brazilian elites, right? Conveying like the popular culture to the elites. And now it has been challenged. The word should not be used anymore. It's an offensive word. They have been, not putting, at least on the main channel, the naked lady anymore. I don't even know if they did a vignette this year. So this happens quite a lot, even like Brazilians selling this, and which is this internalized version of otherness that is sold and commercialized. And I feel like, yeah, there is a gaze that the Brazilian woman is sexy and sexualized. And when it's so like this, and when workers themselves, they pass this idea through to their clients, right? I'm gonna give you advice on how to do good sex now that you are walking sex. It definitely plays a role, but on the other hand, is a role that it's not good for Brazilian immigrant women that are out there. And we have another paper that is on R&R right now that we sort of talk about this, like how this sexualized image of the Brazilian women, it affects the lives of Brazilian immigrants out there, because it's sort of like people put you in this stereotype right away. So, yeah.
Do you think that, I'm really fascinated, do you think that the workers are still now reproducing this idea, or it's something that was more at the, let's say, beginning, foundational moment of the popularity of the Brazilian? So what I'm thinking is, in my own experience, the waxing room is a space of intimacy with the worker. Like, you're letting someone else getting really close to your body, and there are very topics about, feeling clean or feeling proper and all that. But also it can get very intimate, and you discuss about your private life and what is going on. Because, let's face it, is one of those professions that really deal with your body, and in that very kind of direct way. So do you think that becoming a sex counselor is something that workers are interested in doing, or is something that has been happening at that point in time and not reproducing anymore?
So that's why we need to go to the field right now, right? Because the works that we read, and again, we have read this book about the Chase sisters, and there was this one waxer, and she did this book basically about the funny things that happened, and she was a Brazilian lady also in the US, and this is all this early 2000s. There was a change in sexuality and how sexuality is perceived in this last 20 years, for sure. So we need to go and ask. I can say my own personal perception of, like, as a customer, is that in Brazil, I feel like these conversations are very, like, even the professional sometimes initiates them, right? It's more open. And here in Europe, I feel like when you go to do whatever, not just waxing, but like your nails, your hair, there is less. The connection is not like the connection between customer and professional is just different. There's not this openness, this almost ultimate intimacy that, okay, you're going to be discussing sexuality very open with people you don't know for like an hour. And this is not necessarily a good thing, because as we read in the literature review for the chapter, this is also a form of like unpaid care work, if you want to say. Like, the professional is sometimes opening her own life to please the customer, and does she really want this, or she's just performing it? So It's problematic as well, but it's sort of like what creates the connection, sort of spreads the practice. But I think that we would need to, and that's what we want to do, interview Brazilian professionals outside of Brazil, in Europe and in Australia.
That's quite interesting to consider also the emotional labor that the service provider is doing during that moment, because yes, there is this level of intimacy of bodies coming together, and the consumer, the customer, is in a more vulnerable position. You're naked, you're in pain, which is a quite interesting situation to find yourself in that you don't necessarily do in service contexts. And then the professional is also in an intimate position, especially when they do this type of emotional or care labor. And most often it's women that do this type of service work, and other women that are the recipients of the service provision, in a sense. So it's quite interesting to unpack these dynamics. And when you're talking about immigrant women with Western clients and also with Brazilian clients, I think that will be really interesting to see your findings from that stage of your research.
If you know anyone that does this type of work and you want to talk to us, please.
I like how you extended also to other fields, such as the one of nails, for example, which is another industry where many immigrant women work, for example. So it is quite evident how we need to acknowledge that sort of emotional labor as well, but the level of intimacy that is built just because like you're putting your hands into someone's hands for an hour, and your own body into someone's hands for even more than an hour. It's definitely interesting. And something that I was thinking, how are where the J sisters promoting the Brazilian? Like, what were the aspects of the Brazilians that were kind of the Brazilian waxing that were salient for them?
If you read the book, it's exactly the sexuality thing, be the Brazilian goddess, playing quite a lot with this colonial image. But they did not have only waxing, they had like the whole thing, right? I don't know how do you call this in the UK, but in France, they call it lissage brésilien. It's really like the Brazilian straightening. So it's called like this in France. And
what is that?
The keratin treatment to straighten your hair.
Just like really, really straight. And the Brazilian nails, which is like you go tip down with your cuticle. So, there's like a whole way of doing this Brazilian beauty. And they were really selling this as this imaginary of the Brazilian girl. I don't know if they had also a fake tanning or whatever, but I know that when you read the book, that's what they want to promote. Brazilian allure and sexiness, and which again is really about how this internalized image, when internalized otherness that you sort of sell. I don't know if in Greece, in the tourist industry, you probably also have something like this, and maybe for some parts of Italy also.
Definitely is the sort of romance and romancing is part of the identity, right? Which is marketed or sold like in many products in many industries that are like connected to Italian identity. As an anecdote, I once went to a salon that offered like a British bikini. I still have to figure out what a British bikini would be about. I guess a very limited waxing. I don't know. But this is the Western take on the topic. Yeah.
It's quite interesting to see how these ideas or beauty ideals are communicated to mass audiences. You mentioned the Brazilian manicure, which resembles the Russian manicure that is now becoming extremely popular on social media, which is basically working on your cuticles, which is something, for example, in Greece, they don't call it the Russian manicure, it's just a simple manicure. But then these labels become popular, and for example, on platforms like TikTok, you have a lot of conversations around these types of grooming practices that become popular, and then a lot of Western women start to adopt these types of grooming practices that they wouldn't otherwise. And then you have countries where they are very self-evident. But how do you think that social media are changing the way that we're talking about body modifications or body grooming practices now, if you compare that to Sex and the City and the popularity of these practices back then?
Well, then again, this is work in progress. Hopefully it's going to be there, but we have this study that we are really trying to understand how women consumers, how the women, they engage with dieting and exercise routines in relation to what they see and how influencers they do it. Because Sex and the City, you have like one element and one episode, and it's like, oh, this exists and this is cool. But when we go to influencers, TikTok, and now since we have this shift from social to media, right? In socials, have all these micro trends, and there are so many details on how to which product, all the process and repetition, because then you got like these influencers that are basically someone just taking their cuticles every day, and all their content is about it. I'm pretty sure that I never seen one, but I'm pretty sure that if we search for it, we're gonna find it, right? And so there's like this huge exposure and a how-to that is so detailed, but at the same time, especially with TikTok, and this is not connected to my research, but it's like what we see, the micro trends there are so ephemeral, right? It's like 1 week you have this, and another week we have that, and this is complicated for, I feel like, consumers who try to know what should I follow now, because at the end they end up following the following, right? It's the trend itself that becomes the goal. So it's complicated. I don't know if I have an answer for this, but also we have Ozempic now, which is also, it's a phenomenon, but it's also a micro trend of some sorts, and then very speculative. But since we are in this, I don't know if we can talk about politics in this podcast. Okay.
Of course.
Okay. So I don't know if you saw this, but a lot of people discussing fashion right now as like some almost fascist fashion, right? Because we are entering in a moment where women should be sober, clean girl, owe money, but men, they can like display this objects of luxury. So big yachts now, big cars, cool, but women, they should be discreet, and this sort of affects the body practices as well. You know, how we're going to do your nail art, or we are in a very weird and complicated situation on how young women, where they're going to find inspiration to behave, you know. So
it's quite interesting to see the rise of conservative fashion, with people removing their tattoos, for example, and adopting this clean aesthetic that you've mentioned.
And I feel like one thing that, again, when you talk about body modification, doing research in body modification, you always go back to the Kardashians as well, you know, like, because at the end of the day, they are still. And a couple years ago, like 4 or 5 years ago, everyone was putting and enhancing their booty, right? You had like all this
Big hips.
Big hips, hip, yeah, but it's not a hip. Now this probably will have to be added. How do I say this? Like the BBL? No.
Yeah, BBL.
The BBL. Everyone's doing the BBLs, right? And now everyone's taking them off because, fascist. The female body cannot be exuberant anymore. It has to be discreet and hidden. So, thinness is back, and I think, to me, it's insane how people just put implants, and then they take implants as if they were putting a piece of jewelry, like it's a surgery. So yeah, it's this is something there are not many studies in plastic surgery, and especially in aesthetic treatments, and I would like to see a little bit more of them, because it's also insane and huge, and sometimes I'm quite shocked how people are changing their faces and their bodies with the pace of the micro trends.
As we speak, I was thinking that because we all do consumer research, we are really working in a spectrum, right? Between, so aesthetic treatments such as waxing or doing your nails are on a spectrum with all the body modifications, because it's part of the same world. But we tend to focus more often on, the plastic surgery, which is probably the one of the extremes. But like there are all these midways and more routinary ways of doing body modification, like of which nails and hair and grooming is part of, right? Do you think that going back to the example of the Brazilian, because as you were speaking, I was thinking about the context of the early 2000s. So was that almost like the opposite context, where like the female body could take more space? Was there something about the context for the Brazilian to become so relevant?
I think politically, Brazil was in a moment that was going out there, right? So we had the first term of President Lula, and I think he did something interesting for the image of the country. We had because like a little bit of history. So Brazil has been through this military dictatorship in the 60s until the mid-80s, and then we have been through an interesting political times in the 80s with hyperinflation of like even 1,000% in a month. It was very, very crazy. I remember this when I was a kid. And then in the 90s, we had the Fernando Henrique Cardoso that brought some economic stabilization for the country. A couple of, we got the World Cup in 1994. We lost in 1998. Traumatic, but and then we got it again in 2002. So this, the World Cups plus Lula plus, the economy sort of growing, and then an oil boom in Brazil also in the early 2000s. So a lot of things were going that I think Brazil was becoming interesting in the international scene, and I feel like this played a role of okay, this country it's interesting. People are talking about it in media a little bit more, and then we had the Bolsonaro years, and yeah, not that interesting anymore. And I feel like now maybe in terms of movies, it's sort of gaining a revival in terms of culture. But I feel like in the early 2000s, there was this specifically about Brazil. Also, I feel like we were living some sort of optimistic era and overconsumption era, right? So I'm thinking JCR's paper, Coskuner-Balli's paper, that she tells the story of American neoliberalism, and it was the moment when Bush said, go out there and shop. So people were trying, what can I shop that is interesting? And there were, I don't know if feminist movements, I really think that this, what we call this fourth wave feminist, if you can call it, is more post Me Too. But still, through consumption, you have this choice feminism going, not political, but sexual, agentic going on. This is more the factors that I see that made Brazilian waxing a thing.
Brilliant. This is so good. I mean, I feel like we could talk about waxing practices for a while with some very private anecdotes, and maybe we will after this recording. So thank you so much, Carol, for joining us today. And we will link the chapter in our podcast. And of course, we're waiting for more of this research because it sounds fascinating. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
And thank you everyone for listening, and hopefully we'll be back next week with another special guest.